The tremor was felt first, not in the military command centers of the Pentagon, but in the currency trading floors of Singapore and London. In the seconds following the initial news flash, the dollar lurched, oil spiked, and a collective intake of breath was registered across every global market. The strike, when it came, was not the massive aerial campaign that analysts had predicted, not the weeks of sustained bombing that would signal a deliberate escalation. It was instead a single, precise, devastating surgical operation. A flight of B-2 Spirit bombers operating from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, penetrating deep into Iranian airspace under cover of electronic warfare, delivering a payload designed for one purpose only. The target, confirmed by Pentagon officials in a terse statement released at dawn in Washington, was a facility buried deep beneath a mountain in the Zagros Range, a site that intelligence agencies had monitored for years but never before deemed sufficiently critical to risk direct attack. Within that fortified complex, Iranian scientists had been racing to complete final assembly of a nuclear device, enriching uranium to weapons-grade levels and integrating it into a warhead design that Israeli intelligence believed could be mounted on a medium-range ballistic missile. The bunker-busting munitions, the most powerful conventional weapons in the American arsenal, penetrated 200 feet of rock and reinforced concrete before detonating. The destruction was total. Seismic sensors registered the event as a minor earthquake, and when the dust settled, satellite imagery revealed a crater where the mountainside had once stood. Iranian state television, caught between the need to acknowledge the attack and the imperative to control the narrative, initially reported a technical accident at a mining facility before the truth became impossible to suppress. The death toll, when it was finally compiled by Revolutionary Guard intelligence officers, exceeded 700, including 43 nuclear scientists and engineers, 16 senior military commanders overseeing the program, and an unknown number of Russian technicians who had been advising on advanced centrifuge cascades. President Trump, appearing before cameras in the White House briefing room just hours after the strike, offered no apology and expressed no regret. His demeanor was that of a man who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to defend it before history. The United States will not allow the world's leading state sponsor of terror to possess the world's most dangerous weapon, he declared, his voice measured but his eyes hard. We have sent a clear message. The era of American restraint is over. We will protect our citizens, our allies, and our interests by any means necessary. And if Iran chooses to retaliate, they will face a response the likes of which has never been seen. The Israeli reaction was swift and triumphant. Prime Minister Netanyahu, who had reportedly been given advance warning of the strike only minutes before the bombers entered Iranian airspace, addressed his nation from the Kiryat military headquarters in Tel Aviv. For decades, we have warned the world of the existential danger posed by a nuclear-armed Iran, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For decades, our warnings were met with diplomatic platitudes and failed negotiations. Tonight, our great ally, the United States, has done what needed to be done. Israel stands with America today and always, and we are prepared to defend ourselves by ourselves if necessary. In Tehran, the initial shock gave way to a fury that consumed the regime from the supreme leader's office to the streets of the capital. Mojtaba Khamenei, still recovering from the wounds he sustained in the strike that killed his father, issued a written statement that was read on state television by a Revolutionary Guard commander. The criminal American regime has crossed every red line, the statement declared. They have attacked our sovereign territory, murdered our finest scientists, and sought to deny the Iranian nation its rightful place among the powers of the world. They will learn, as all our enemies have learned throughout history, that the lions of Persia do not forgive and do not forget. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and nearly universal in its condemnation of the American action. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session within hours. The chamber electric with tension as ambassadors jostled to deliver their statements. The Russian representative, his voice dripping with contempt, compared the strike to an act of war and demanded an immediate ceasefire. The Chinese ambassador, more measured but equally firm, warned of catastrophic consequences for regional stability. Even America's traditional allies, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, issued statements expressing profound concern and calling for restraint, careful to avoid endorsing the strike while stopping short of outright condemnation. The Arab capitals of the Gulf reacted with a terror that they struggled to conceal. Saudi Arabia's King Salman, in a phone call with President Trump, expressed deep worry about the potential for Iranian retaliation that would inevitably target his kingdom. The United Arab Emirates, which had normalized relations with Israel in the hope of containing Iran, now found itself exposed, its glittering towers potential targets for the very fury it had sought to avoid. Qatar, hosting the largest American military base in the region, faced an impossible choice between its American protector and its powerful Persian neighbor. Across the Gulf, contingency plans were activated and emergency supplies stockpiled. The Iranian response, when it came, was not the immediate missile barrage that many feared, but something more methodical and potentially more devastating. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, operating through its network of proxies across the region, activated a coordinated campaign of harassment and destruction designed to bleed American interests without triggering an overwhelming counter-response. In Iraq, Kataib Hezbollah rockets struck the American embassy in Baghdad's Green Zone, wounding several personnel and forcing a partial evacuation. In Syria, Iranian-backed militias overran a small American outpost near the Jordanian border, capturing 4 soldiers whose fates immediately became a national obsession in Washington. The Houthis in Yemen, armed and directed by Iranian trainers, escalated their campaign against Red Sea shipping with a fury that shocked even seasoned maritime security analysts. Over a period of 72 hours, they attacked 17 commercial vessels, sinking 3 and damaging a dozen more with suicide drones and anti-ship missiles. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the southern gateway to the Suez Canal, became a no-go zone for international shipping, forcing vessels to take the long route around Africa and adding weeks to transit times. The global supply chain, already fragile after years of disruption, buckled under the strain. The economic consequences cascaded through the global system with terrifying speed. Oil prices, already elevated by the initial strike, surged past $150 per barrel, a level not seen since the 1970s. Gasoline prices in the United States exceeded $6 per gallon, triggering panic buying and shortages in some regions. The stock markets of Europe and Asia plunged into bear territory, wiping out trillions in value as investors fled to the safety of gold and government bonds. The inflation that resulted, feeding into food prices and heating costs, threatened to trigger social unrest in countries from France to Pakistan, where governments were already fragile. In Washington, the Trump administration found itself in a war for which it had not fully prepared. The initial assumption, shared by the president and his national security team, was that the strike would so degrade Iran's nuclear program that Tehran would have no choice but to accept the new reality. The assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Instead of cowing the regime, the strike had unified it, silencing internal dissent and rallying the population behind the leadership. Instead of ending the conflict, it had expanded it, drawing American forces into a multi-front confrontation that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The human cost, always the last consideration in geopolitical calculations, began to mount with sickening regularity. The 4 American soldiers captured in Syria became the focus of national anguish. Their faces displayed on cable news channels alongside the hashtag, Bring Them Home. The families of the 700 Iranians killed in the bunker strike, their grief weaponized by the regime, became symbols of American brutality in propaganda broadcasts across the Middle East. In Israel, the rocket attacks from Lebanon and Gaza, intensified by Iran's proxy forces, killed civilians in their homes and sent the population scrambling for shelters with a frequency that normalized the abnormal. The nuclear clock, rather than stopping, accelerated. Despite the destruction of the Zagros facility, Iran's nuclear program was more dispersed and more resilient than Western intelligence had appreciated. Enrichment continued at underground sites unknown to the IAEA, and the knowledge required to assemble a weapon resided not in any facility, but in the minds of scientists now scattered across the country. The regime, its survival at stake, had every incentive to race toward a bomb as quickly as possible, calculating that only nuclear weapons could deter the American colossus from further strikes. The strike intended to prevent proliferation had become its most powerful catalyst. The Israeli calculus shifted dramatically in the days following the American attack. Netanyahu, emboldened by Washington's willingness to use force, pressed for a coordinated campaign against Iran's remaining nuclear infrastructure, arguing that the window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The Israeli Air Force, already positioned for strikes against Lebanese Hezbollah, was placed on heightened alert, its pilots briefed on targets deep inside Iran. But the military leadership, more cautious than the politicians, warned of the risks. Iran's air defenses, though degraded, remained formidable, and a failed Israeli strike would be a strategic catastrophe of the first order. The Russian role in the crisis deepened in ways that alarmed Western strategists. Moscow, viewing the American strike as a violation of international law and a threat to its own regional interests, accelerated weapons deliveries to Iran, including advanced S-400 air defense systems and electronic warfare capabilities that could blind American surveillance. Russian military advisors, previously operating discreetly, were now openly present at Iranian command centers, coordinating defensive operations and sharing intelligence. The risk of a direct Russian-American confrontation, once unthinkable, became a live possibility that haunted every escalation decision. The Chinese response was more measured but equally significant. Beijing, having invested billions in Iranian infrastructure and energy projects, watched the destruction with alarm. The Belt and Road Initiative, already struggling, faced complete collapse if the conflict expanded. In a carefully calibrated move, Chinese diplomats opened back-channel communications with both Tehran and Washington, offering mediation services while quietly positioning China as the indispensable power in any post-conflict reconstruction. The message to both sides was clear. China would not take sides, but China would ensure that its interests were protected. The domestic American political landscape shifted in unpredictable ways. Trump's approval rating, initially buoyed by the strike, began to erode as casualties mounted and the economic pain spread. The anti-war wing of the Democratic Party, silenced in the immediate aftermath of the attack, found its voice again, organizing protests and demanding congressional authorization for any further military action. The president's Republican allies, while publicly supportive, privately worried about the electoral consequences of a protracted conflict. The unity of the first days fractured along familiar partisan lines, leaving the administration increasingly isolated. The European powers, caught between their alliance with America and their proximity to the chaos, struggled to find a coherent response. The United Kingdom, despite its historical special relationship with Washington, refused to commit forces to any further strikes, its military already stretched thin by commitments elsewhere. France and Germany, long advocates of diplomatic engagement with Iran, watched their efforts collapse in the face of American unilateralism. The European Union, desperate to maintain relevance, proposed a regional security conference that would include all parties, a proposal that was politely received and immediately ignored. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding across the Middle East received far less attention than the military maneuvers, but its scale was unprecedented. In Iran, the American strikes had destroyed power grids and water treatment facilities, creating a secondary public health crisis. In Lebanon, already crippled by economic collapse, the influx of refugees from Syria and Iraq overwhelmed what remained of the state's capacity. In Yemen, the Houthi escalation against shipping had closed the ports through which 90% of food and medicine entered the country, pushing a starving population toward famine. The United Nations, paralyzed by great power rivalries, could only issue increasingly desperate appeals. The military commanders on the ground, American and Iranian alike, understood the dangers of escalation more clearly than the politicians in distant capitals. In the Persian Gulf, American and Iranian naval vessels shadowed each other at dangerous proximity, the risk of a misinterpreted signal or an accidental collision growing with each passing day. In the skies above Syria, American and Russian aircraft engaged in aerial cat-and-mouse games that violated every protocol established to prevent conflict. The professionals trained to manage escalation found themselves operating in conditions where escalation managed them. The intelligence agencies of both sides, normally the Lungjing est voices in any crisis, were overwhelmed by the volume of reporting and the speed of events. The CIA, its assets in Iran degraded by years of hostile penetration, struggled to provide reliable assessments of the regime's intentions. The Mossad, its attention divided between Iran and its proxies, missed indicators of the coordinated proxy campaign that followed the strike. The Iranian Ministry of Intelligence, its leadership decimated by previous attacks, operated on instinct and ideology rather than reliable information. In the fog of war, the one commodity in shortest supply was clarity. As the crisis entered its third week, the question that haunted every chancellery was no longer whether the conflict would expand, but how far and how fast. The strike that was supposed to end the threat had become its accelerator. The precision operation that was supposed to demonstrate American resolve had revealed American isolation. The show of force that was supposed to deter retaliation had provoked it. And in Tehran, in the undisclosed location where the wounded supreme leader governed by written statement, the next move was being prepared, a move that his advisors promised would change everything once again.